Thank you, everybody, for joining today. We know how busy this time of year is, and we just appreciate you so much. This is Soundwalls Part 2. Hear more about literacy success. I'm Jillian Castor, Community Manager for Reading Horizons. And our hosts, Stacy, Lindsay, and Donell, will be leading the webinar today, but I am going to just share some information to get us started. So today we are excited to have our Science of Reading experts to lead our discussion on sound walls. We have Stacy Hurst, a professor of teacher education at Southern Utah University. Lindsay Kemeny is a certified structured literacy classroom teacher. She's going to be moving to first grade next year, so we're excited to hear about that. She's in Utah. And then Donell Pons, a dyslexic educator, presenter, consultant, and reading tutor working with adult learners. So we're going to hear about, this instruction with some older learners. And this terrific trio is also the host of the hit podcast, Literacy Talks. So if you have not watched that or listened in, you need to check it out because it's awesome. So two quick announcements before we get started. This webinar is being hosted by Reading Horizons, and at Reading Horizons, we support educators with tech-enabled foundational reading program aligned to the science of reading to help all students reach reading proficiency by the end of third grade. And we know that onboarding and implementing the science of reading can be challenging for districts to get off the ground. And that is why the Reading Horizons research team is recruiting collaborative partners that we can support the district with professional learning and coaching while identifying evidence of impact on student outcomes and teacher practice. So this comes at no cost to districts while participating in this research. So if you are interested, we are still solidifying for the 2022-23 school year. So reach out to Stephanie Myers. Her email is here at the bottom to see if you qualify. And then one last quick announcement is that we are giving away another Sound City kit. So not only is this the sound wall posters, cards, individual student cards, but it also comes with a teacher's manual. So you get the lessons that go along with it and a manual for daily phonemic awareness. So I am going to turn it over to Lindsay now to start us off. And thank you again, everybody, for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. I'm just going to quickly recap what we talked about in our part 1. And then I'll turn the time over to Stacy, and she's going to talk about using a sound wall with English learners. And then we'll turn the time over to Donell, who will talk about her work in using a sound wall with adult learners. So I'm excited. So I think when we talk about a sound wall, it's really important to remember the overall goal. And so our overall goal is not to develop, sound wall experts or little linguists, right? Our overall goal is for proficient readers and spellers. And so how do we get to proficient reading? Well, our students need to read words accurately and with automaticity. And how do we get there? Well, they need to have those solid phoneme grapheme correspondences. And how do we get there? Well, we want to have, phoneme instruction with the articulatory features and then solidify those phonemes with the graphemes and make that connection. So I think it's important to remember that. Remember our overall goal. Why use a sound wall? Well, I love this research that I've cited here, where there is some research that supports teaching students the articulatory features. This doesn't mean that we need to get super technical with our students, but we can draw an awareness to what our lips, teeth, or tongue are doing when we say a sound, and then connect that with the grapheme. And so there is this study where students that were taught those articulatory features along with the phonemic awareness were able to spell and read more accurately than the group that was taught phonemic awareness without these articulatory features. All right, so in our part 1, we talked about the 44 phonemes of English. Remember, a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in our speech. So the word chip would have 3 phonemes, ch, I, p. And the number can vary. Sometimes you'll see a little less than 44 phonemes, but it depends on dialect, and 44 is most commonly agreed upon. So in our last webinar, we went through all these phonemes. So I highly suggest you watch part 1 because that's really going to give you a basis into how a sound wall is set up and about all these phonemes. So we can categorize the phonemes by consonant phonemes and vowel phonemes. And our consonants, we can organize by both place and manner of articulation. And remember, a place of articulation is where it's happening in the mouth, where it's at, if it's at the front, the middle, or the back. And then manner of articulation is describing what's happening with the airflow when we produce those sounds. And we went through each of these categories: the stops, nasals, fricatives, affricates, glides, and liquids. And we also went through the vowel phonemes. We talked about this vowel valley and why they're set up this way. You'll remember that our chin is dropping lower and lower as we go through these sounds. So if you look, I can start at the top and I can say E, I, A, ah, and you can see my chin dropping, and then it's going to come back up as we go up. So again, review part 1 if you haven't already. We also showed you a digital sound wall, which is just, and we showed you the consonant chart here, which is really kid-friendly, and a digital version of the vowel valley, and we talked about that. When you're organizing your sound wall, it's about making it accessible for the students so they can use it and it becomes a tool for them. All right, we also talked about how to set up your sound wall last time. And you can, you want to separate your consonant phonemes with your vowel phonemes. And so you can see here, I have like a green divider between both sections. And you could use phoneme grapheme cards like I have shown here, or posters. We talked about and showed you lots of examples last time of different ways you can set it up in your classroom. And then it's important to remember to cover up those graphemes with sticky notes until you've explicitly taught them. It can be overwhelming for a student to come in and see all the spellings. So at the beginning of the year, I look at my sound wall, I cover up any spellings that I don't already expect students to know, and then as I'm teaching them, I'm going to unveil them. All right, after our last webinar, we had some questions about what about Q and X? Where do those go on the sound wall? And these letters are interesting because they are not new phonemes. So you typically don't see these on the sound wall because Q is a combination of 2 phonemes that we already have on our sound wall, K and W. And same with X. X is a letter that represents 2 phonemes, K and S. So you could still choose to put these on the sound wall if you want to represent them and maybe your students are going to ask about them. So you could just put them in their own spot. You can see this is my classroom here, and I've just kind of put them over here on the right side in their own category. So that was a great question. We also last time talked about what sound wall instruction looks like. And we showed a video of me teaching a sound wall lesson in my classroom. So you can check that out. And really, when I think about my sound wall instruction, first of all, I think the instruction is the most important thing. It's not just this poster on a wall, because anyone can throw a poster up on the wall, but it's how you use it and how you use it to have, clarity in your instruction. And so what I do is I think of flipping my instruction to start with the sound instead of starting with the letter, with the grapheme. So let's say I'm going to teach in my phonics lesson, I'm going to teach the OA spelling for O. Well, now I'm going to start that lesson with the sound O. We're going to talk about the sound O. We're going to look at what our mouths are doing and how they're rounding. And then the same day, after just a few minutes of that, then I'm going to say, okay, here is the spelling we're going to talk about today. We're talking about the spelling OA, and it serves as this really nice bridge into my phonics instruction. And same with you're in kindergarten. You're thinking, typically we think letter a day. Think of just flipping that to say sound of the day. And I'm going to start by describing the sound. And then the same day, I'm going to connect it with the letter. I would not recommend spending a month in kindergarten only doing sound wall and never getting to the letter, because it's really important that we make that connection. And I used to teach kindergarten, and there is no time to waste. So I definitely suggest just think of starting with the sound and then connecting it with the letter. And again, look at our part 1 for for an example of a lesson there. Okay. And then how to implement. We had a lot of questions from last time about exactly how to implement Soundwell lessons and what order to go. The very best way is to connect it with your phonics scope and sequence. So you're going to look at your phonics scope and sequence of your phonics program, and you're going to decide where you could put a Soundwell lesson. And there's only, 44 sounds, so you won't have a sound wall or a new sound wall lesson every day. So maybe you decide, I'm going to do the O sound wall lesson when I teach O consonant E in my phonics scope and sequence. And then, maybe later in the year, you're going to teach OA. Well, you're just going to do a little quick review where it is on the sound wall so students can access it, and then go into your phonics. So if you teach I think it's really easy to implement when you're, teaching kindergarten and first grade, and you're already going through almost all those sounds anyway. It might be a little tougher, like if you're older, like maybe third grade, because, you don't spend a day on each letter. So in that case, you might want to do a quick review at the beginning of the year. So maybe one day you're going to talk about all the stop sounds, and you're going to show them the common spellings for those. And then maybe the next day you're going to talk about all the fricatives. And so that then when you're teaching your phonics lessons, you can refer back and the students have a little background knowledge there. So hopefully I know that was quick. And if you didn't watch part 1, then please go back and watch part 1, because we can go a little slower there and we go through all that information. So Stacy, I'm going to turn the time over to you.
Okay, let's set the scene. I'm going to talk about how to modify or adjust our sound wall instruction for English language learners. And I think anybody who is teaching can relate to these statistics. We have a lot of English language learners in our classroom. And statistically speaking, 80% of those are Spanish speakers. So when I am talking today, just for the purpose of simplicity, I'm going to be referring to a lot of things in the Spanish language. Regardless of what language they speak initially, 3 to 10% of English language learners are proficient according to the NAEP. That is highly discrepant. We already know that English speakers as their first language, they're not doing well either. They're only 30 to 35% proficient, but there's still a really big gap. So we really can help fill that. Anybody who's taken English language instruction for like an endorsement knows that it takes 1 to 2 years for any English language learner to develop those proficient skills in just speaking and listening, or basic interpersonal communicative skills, but 5 to 7 years for them to develop those skills on an academic cognitive language proficiency level. That is not something, however, because of that we can just say, oh, they're going to be behind the rest of my class. The good news is that we know that they can achieve grade level norms with proper instruction. And today we're going to focus on sound walls, but there's a lot more that goes into English language learners instruction for those students. the good news also is that they need generally the same instruction as non-English learners when they're learning to read, with just some adjustments. So we don't have to overhaul our curriculum and do something totally new, right? We do know, Lindsay talked about this in her part of the presentation. We covered this in the first part of our Soundwall Ed webinar, and that is that literacy is built on language. And we know some things about oral language proficiency in a first language absolutely affects the performance in all other languages. So those strong language skills are necessary to comprehend written text, which is our goal, right? We want to read for meaning. And I think of the simple view of reading, of course, when I hear that. Students learning English as a new language really do have to understand, at least on a very adequate level, the differences in the structure of both languages. And that includes a lot of things like the phonology and the sound symbol associations. We always want to develop the alphabetic principle in whichever language we're learning. That syllable structure, the morphological structure, there's a lot that goes into language, syntactics, semantics, and pragmatics. But our focus for today is on sound walls. So the specific parts of language that sound wall can help us address are the phonology and the sound symbol correspondences, so that phoneme, grapheme area, and of course the alphabetic principle. And we're going to add semantics. And I think of vocabulary sometimes when I think of semantics, because we always want to be focusing on meaning. And we know that when things are meaningful for students, they get in their long-term memory a lot easier. Okay, so there are 4 adjustments that we need to make to Soundwall instruction for our English language learners. We're going to leverage their first language to teach the components of English. So when we're talking about those 4 elements are phoneme, letter, vocabulary instruction, and then we're going to provide more explicit instruction for them. So for the phoneme instruction, as a teacher, you need to have a basic understanding of the structure of the phonemes in the student's first language and make connections between the two. Now, I really should have made bold and underlined the word basic. You do not need to speak the other language. You do not need to be a professional in knowing that language, but having a basic knowledge will help you make the connections for the student that will help them. Same thing with letter instruction. If we're talking about Spanish, that is an alphabetic language as well, but you may have some students who don't have an alphabetic language. But if you have a basic understanding of the writing system, again, that's the important thing. So vocabulary instruction, we're always going to be teaching the meaning of the words that were used during Soundwall instruction or during phonemic awareness instruction or any kind of instruction, right? We're going to make sure that they're understanding what that means. So for English language learners specifically, they also need more explicit instruction. And when I say explicit instruction, they need very specific modeling, practice opportunities, and with valuable feedback and repetition, right? Because they're actually doing a lot in their brain to make that switch from English to from their first language. So those are the 4 things. Let me talk about what each of those looks like really briefly. So with phoneme instruction using a Soundwall for ELL students, they don't need to be proficient in English to acquire phonemic awareness. So that's something that's going to be important for us to remember as we're teaching them. Phonemic awareness in one language will transfer to another. So as a teacher, I like to get a sense of their basic phonemic awareness in their first language. Now, because we're focusing on Spanish a little bit more today, there is a book. In fact, I'll hold it up. If you will forgive how tattered it is, because I use it frequently. But it's assessing reading multiple measures. It's by CORE. We've heard of them. And they have a phonemic awareness assessment in Spanish. It's really easy to administer, and you get a good idea of where your students are. We also need to have a basic understanding that between the structure of the phonemes in the student's first language and make connections between those two. If that sounds overwhelming, the very first thing that you should do is just identify the sounds that we have in English that they don't have in their first language. And then when you're instructing on those, you can really emphasize them. We're going to focus today on the short sound of I, which is I. That is not a phoneme that you hear in Spanish. I will have some websites that will give you that information in a really palatable way. And that's going to be on the next slide. So I'm preparing you to either get your pencil ready or screenshot it. But you can access this webinar later as well. And then we want to emphasize placement and manner of articulation, just as we do with our other students. And as Lindsay pointed out, that's critical because our brain recognizes our motor functions as we make those sounds. So it's not just what we're hearing, it's what our mouth is doing. Okay, here are the websites that are really useful. ASHA.org has a phonemic inventory and cultural and linguistic information across languages section of their website. What you're seeing on the right side of the screen is a screenshot I took from that website. So it tells us Spanish does not have the following sounds. They list them by category. I know that when I'm instructing that in my sound wall instruction and then later in my phonics instruction, we can re-emphasize that. Colorincolorado.org is so great. I almost can't emphasize that enough. There are a lot of resources on there. They have a section called Capitalizing on similarities and differences between Spanish and English. It is also very helpful. Now, I'm not going to belabor this slide, but this is an example that I got off of that website that very briefly has the shared phonemes. These are the consonant phonemes in English. Between English and Spanish are in red. The ones that are in Spanish only in purple. The ones that are in Spanish only are in red, and then the blue are the English only. And then they have links to how those are pronounced. So it's very useful. So I would recommend that. So letter instruction using a sound wall, we do need to explicitly teach that English is comprised of 44 sounds and 26 letters. Now remember, if we have a basic understanding of their alphabetic system, for example, in Spanish, Spanish has 30 letters. So that's important to point out to our students so they know what kind of data they're dealing with, right? A basic understanding of the letters in the student's first language. And again, I emphasize that word basic. Compare those similarities and differences, not only between the sounds, but between the letters. So the way those sounds are spelled and the letter names. So you're going to focus instruction on both, but also emphasize the differences. So for example, in Spanish, and I think we could all agree we'd love to teach reading in Spanish, the vowel sounds don't change. The names of the vowel sounds are their sounds, always. So when you're teaching the name of a vowel sound in Spanish, you're also teaching the sound, the name of the letter that represents the sound. But in English, they change. I think that's important to explicitly mention to students who have a basic understanding of Spanish, if that's their first language. With letter recognition, and this recommendation comes from Elsa Cardenas Hagen. I will leave you a book that she wrote as a slide at the end of my part that I recommend everybody get because it's so useful. But she recommends for English language learners to teach the letter names in English in ABC order with a lot of repetition. And I know that there's a lot of discussion about that in the world of reading instruction, but her recommendation is that, and I'm prone to believe it. She's a great expert and resource. So you need to get an idea of how well they know their letter names and sounds in their first language. Again, that core assessment, that book I just showed, that has a phonics survey in Spanish also that is very useful for that. The goal is the same at this part of reading development, which is letter sound recognition. As you're talking about vocabulary during sound wall instruction, we use words because we are teaching students all about words. So you're briefly going to define those words that you use during sound wall and phonemic awareness instruction. The best way I found to do this when I was teaching English language development is to pre-teach those words during small group instruction, the words that you're going to use in your sound wall instruction, perhaps the next day. And use pictures to help make those connections between the word and the meaning of the word. And then learn some of those words in the student's first language. Really quickly, I'll give you an example. I was assessing a student once in Spanish. She had just moved from El Salvador. She was a first grader, and I was assessing her, and I was assessing her in English, and she didn't understand the task I was asking her to do. Now, my Spanish is very minimal, as you will see, but I used words in Spanish to help describe what I wanted her to do for that test. I did that the second time. I didn't do it the first time. And she presented very differently. If I had gone on the way that she did that test the first time, I would have thought she was struggling on many levels. But once I was able to just help her connect a few of those words in Spanish and English so she understood what I was asking her to do, she passed that part with flying colors. So there really is real power in learning some of those words. Again, we don't have to be an expert, but it is really helpful. And lots of resources that we have to do that too. And then blend and segment those sounds that you're using during soundwell instruction, even if we're just focusing on identification. So for example, if we're talking about the word dog in English, we'll segment dog and then blend them together, dog. And then you can make the connection in Spanish. You're going to see how awful I'm at Spanish with that R. Perro is the word in Spanish. And we could even segment those phonemes, right? P-E-R-O. I'm still working on that. So making those connections are really helpful. So remember to model the correct production of those English phonemes when we're talking about explicit instruction. That's critical because we want our students to pronounce them correctly, produce them correctly, so the brain recognizes them when they're reading or speaking or listening. And then give English learners more repetition and practice opportunities with feedback. I can't emphasize enough the importance of doing that in a small group setting and using pre-teaching as a tool to work for you and those students. And then again, you're going to make those connections and compare to their first language when possible. Okay, I only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to run you through a lesson with those adjustments. I am using my Soundwell curriculum. And I know you can't see, I should have taken screenshots and put them on, but I've only written a few notes in here to help me with my instruction. So the point I'm trying to make there is that we don't have to overhaul the curriculum, right? We just need to make sure we're making certain connections. So the lesson we're going to start with today is the vowel short I sound, which is I, okay? So I have written in my teacher notes that this sound is not heard in Spanish. So as we start this, I would say to my students, today we are going to learn about a sound that we have in English, but we don't have in Spanish. And so I'm going to say some words, and I'm going to use these pictures as I say the words. I want you to listen for the first sound in the word. Itch, igloo, insect. And then, of course, I would ask them, what's the sound that you hear? And hopefully they say, I. I say, yes. Now watch my mouth as I make the sound. I. And then have them make it in the mirror. I won't belabor that point. I could follow the script. That is going to be exactly the same. You're going to have them focus on the placement, manner of articulation. And then we're going to say, oh, this is a voiced sound. We're going to talk about that. So it's going to be a vowel. Your mouth is smiling. So it's probably going to be on smile slope when we get to that part in our sound wall. So let's put our mirrors away. And I'm going to say some words. I want you to repeat the words and then tell me thumbs up if you hear the sound in the word, thumbs down if you don't. And remember, we're focusing on the I sound. So again, this is just a slight modification for my English language learners. And I have just circled ahead of time pictures, the ones that I want to get pictures for. So here we go. Okay, the first word that we're going to do is itch. Say it back, and then I'd wait for them to say it back. Itch. Do you hear that sound? And then you do. Lindsay and Donell, you're the only two I can see, so can you play along? Thank you. Feel free if you're listening to do the same. Okay, now I'm going to say the next word, dog. Say it back. Do you hear the sound? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Okay, now let's do the word puddle. Puddle. And we have talked about this word before in our English language instruction. If I knew it in Spanish, I'd use it now. But do you hear that sound in English? Puddle. Nope. How about the word swim? Swim. Say it back. Swim. And yes, you hear it. Sit. Say it back. Yes, you hear it. Now I have an opportunity. Okay, that's in my regular instruction, right? Now I have an opportunity to give them more practice and repetition. So on the next slide, I have just included the words that have that sound in them. So then we could talk about the word sit. Sit in Spanish is sentar. And if you guys, if this is wrong, feel free to correct me because my Spanish is very basic. And then in the word itch, and we could segment it, itch, in those two sounds. Now blend those sounds together. Itch. In Spanish, that word is picar. And then you'd say itch in English, itch. And then swim, blend those sounds together, swim. In Spanish, that word is nadar. And then you would just help them make those connections. Okay, now we locate it on the sound wall. Let's find where it is. And then the next thing we will do is introduce the letter. So here's my letter card. Just like Lindsay recommended, I have a sticky note for the other letter that we haven't taught yet. But I'm going to introduce the name of the letter. In English is I. And then I have the students repeat it. In English, the letter is I. The name of this letter in Spanish, because you will see that in Spanish, but the name in Spanish is E. Again, you're making those connections. In English, the name of the letter is I. So then I would ask them, what's the name of the letter in English? I. What's the sound the letter spells in English? I. And then you just emphasize that. Again, repetition is going to be really important there. And then focus on those key words. Again, I can't recommend this book enough. If you have any English language learners and you haven't purchased this book and read it already, please do. A wealth of information. And then just keeping in mind the ways that we can use sound walls as a tool to teach speech to print, not only for all of our learners, but also for our English language learners. Just provide them with that explicit instruction, the proper production of sounds, help them to identify similarities and differences. And then that will help them when you get to that phonics instruction to have that solid foundation. They're going to remember those sounds and the letters that represent them. And then utilize small group instruction to reteach, give them opportunities for practice, and to give them solid feedback. Okay, I feel like I've been talking a lot. Donell, I would love to hear how this works with older learners.
Great. Well, Stacy did a terrific setup for me. All I've got to do is just come in and add a few things. First of all, I want to say I'm so glad to be alive. I should have a t-shirt that says I survived COVID because I just got over my first bout with COVID, as Stacy knows and Lindsay knows. So I may cough a little bit. I got a little water here, and I'm just happy to be here. Glad to be here. I also want to put a little shout out to I sacrificed my health in order to attend a very important conference that was an opportunity for me. It was the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading Conference, or SSRI. Many teachers maybe are familiar with this conference. It is really just the big research conference where all of the researchers in reading get together and share their studies and their research. And it was fantastic. We spent 4 days in Newport, California. That's where I picked up COVID. I'm sure there are many others, if you were attending, that are probably recovering as well. But in the end, I'm weighing whether it was worth it or not. And still, I'll have to get back to you as to whether I think the whole thing was worth it. But it really was a fantastic conference. I'd heard a lot about the conference. Dr. David Kilpatrick, who has put out a lot of great information, and many others, have always said, hey, if you can make it out to the SSRI conference, it's a fantastic conference. And so it really was. It was a really great one. A lot of information. What's interesting is we've already kind of shared, Stacy, Lindsay, and I, maybe we'll put this into our podcast, some of our podcasts, and talk about some of the research that was presented, ideas that were solidified, things that are still up in the air to kind of chat about. And one of those is the order. You know, is there a preferred order of how you teach these things, the letters, right? And still no, there isn't in all the research that's come together. So when we were talking earlier and Lindsay pointed out, have your sound wall instruction match your phonics instruction, fantastic idea. And you can certainly do that, right? Because there is no preferred order. Stacy, as you talked about with English language learners, you know, perhaps you're looking at what is most comfortable for a student who maybe they all have a primary language and they're learning English, and maybe you format things that way. That also goes with your phonics instruction. So there are a lot of ways to look at this as how we do the order of teaching. The one thing that is constant, though, is teaching the name and the sound. And leading with the sound seems to have some preferential results in the research. So that's why we're leaning into sound first. But those are those two characteristics, that alphabetic principle that's so important. As Stacy and Lindsay have already pointed out some great information about sound walls, I'm going to just cast our view to the adult struggling reader. Remember, they can cross over a lot of categories. Stacy referred to English language learners. They can also be struggling readers in their primary language too. So we need to be aware of that. that may be part of their history too. So look at some of these things. What we know is there's a lack of literacy is a major national concern in this country. That's one thing we do know. And that 30 million adults, this is all coming from Dr. Sally Shaywitz's second edition of Overcoming Dyslexia. That's the notation at the bottom. 30 million adults, that's 14% in the US, score below basic reading level in prose literacy skills. That's skills needed to comprehend and use connected text. That's a huge number. I just want us to kind of sit with that number for a minute. That's a huge number. And even though 45% of those folks graduated from high school. So we have a lot of people who have graduated from educational settings, they have a diploma. I can't tell you how many times I've heard my adult struggling readers say, I got a few diplomas from different programs, and I still struggle just to read basic material, not getting the help they need. How many English language learning students that I have as adult learners who have been here for 20 years in this country have taken numerous programs to learn English and still struggling, and it's because people have overlooked the fact that they have a struggle, primary struggle in language that has never been addressed. So these adults are extremely inefficient readers. They're reading about 60 correct words per minute, a rate expected of first to second graders. Interestingly, surveys report that many limited readers perceive themselves as reading well. So that's the other thing. They don't know any better, right? They've been struggling their whole lives, and maybe they have friends and family who also struggle to read. And so they think, I'm pretty good. That was my husband who has dyslexia. Is when I pointed out to him when I first heard him reading and struggling, and I said, boy, that sounded difficult. And he said, actually, I'm probably the better reader in my household. That's not unusual. So a lot of times they struggle, they're not really realizing how hard it is. And this may explain in some part why only a small percentage of adults, that's less than 10%, who have limited reading ability are enrolled in adult literacy programs. And the other piece is it's hard to find some adult literacy programs, I would add that. So this is all really interesting. Let's move to our next one, instruction at any age. So this is the takeaway. We have a lot of folks who are struggling, have made it into those adult years, and reading is still very difficult. But here's the good news. Any adult, no matter his or her age, who cannot read or who struggles to read should participate in a literacy program. It will turn his or her life around. Literacy skills are critical in providing options for training, jobs, and careers. In trade schools, for example, students are expected to read course manuals written at least a 10th grade level or higher. In fact, in the coming years, the vast majority of new jobs will require a 12th grade reading level. So that's the good news. The good takeaway is you can learn at any age. That is my field, my area. I spend a portion of every single day working with adults who struggle with reading. And so I'm here to tell you that I've seen adults who have had very low literacy skills make it into their 50s and 60s with those very low literacy skills, finally have found a program. They stumble across, find me, we find each other, and then their literacy skills improve in a way they never thought possible. So that is something I work at every day. I know that it's possible. What are the key takeaways for intervening with word level reading difficulties for anyone? And this holds true for adults. And we've talked about a lot of the material that Lindsay and Stacy use, I also use for adult readers, because as Dr. Kilpatrick, when I was sitting through one of his sessions one time, somebody said, this is all great for young readers, but what do I do for adult readers and learners? And Dr. Kilpatrick said, the same stuff. They need it too. So the programs that are most successful with the most successful outcomes for students contain the following three elements, and this holds true for adults as well. Number one, and this is always the number one, they aggressively addressed and corrected the students' phonological awareness difficulties and taught phonological awareness to the advanced level. Within this is phoneme awareness, right? So that's also the alphabetic principle and the basics for phoneme awareness. That's number one. And number two, they provided phonic decoding instruction and or reinforcement. So remember the phonics so important as we tie that in together with all the sound work that we do. And then number three, which again, even this reading conference, the SSRI conference that I attended, this came up many times in conversation. They provided students with ample opportunities to apply these developing skills to reading connected text. It's getting to doing the thing, right? We need to always make sure that our instruction comes back to doing the thing, and that is reading, right? Getting into text, reading, and making sure they have opportunity to graduate through text, right? Take their skill level through text to where it's going to be advantageous to where they are as an adult, right? And that can be done. And that's done the same way you would with younger students using decodable text, connected text, and having that variety of text situations so that students can practice the skills that they're receiving in their instruction with you. Now, one thing I wanted to point out, Stacy did a fantastic job of running through a bit of a lesson on a sound wall. I noticed in the chat that people are saying, what are the materials? What do you have? If you're that lucky soul who gets the package today, wins the lottery today, you'll be getting sound wall materials. That's what we're using those sound wall materials. This is our stuff that we're so excited about. You can find them many places, but it's nice to have a package. This will come with a package of materials. What's interesting is it gets even harder when you work with adults to find sound wall materials, because if you think that this is fairly new in the younger arena of teaching readers, it's nigh impossible in the adult arena to find a lot of materials for sound wall instruction for adults. So I've been using a lot of the materials that we've developed for younger readers for adults. I want to show kind of the stepping stone or pathway that I take with my older students. They're very used to looking at a card just like this. I'm going to hold up a basic card. This will have a representative of a letter. There's a grapheme sitting on the card. Typically what they're used to is you use this card and you can talk about the sounds that go with the card or whatever. You might ask for the name of the card, but this is pretty much what students are used to. On the back of the card is the information that's really more useful, and that's usually for the instructor, and that is the sounds and a key word to go with the various sounds for the card. Like in a vowel case, we're going to have more than a few sounds, right? Whereas our students that on their end, that's all they're seeing. It's just this flat grapheme. They're not getting all those phonemes. That's the beauty of using a sound wall, is that now your students, not only are they going to receive more information about the sounds, you are doing that key piece here, as Lindsay talked about, just articulation. Now, for a lot of the adult students, we move quickly through articulation. They have that part down, but be careful, take an inventory, because oftentimes students do not have those individual phoneme sounds down, and the articulation is not correct, particularly between vowel I and vowel E in the short sound. Many students struggle with that who are adults, and they have no differentiation. And if you can go right to the articulation on that and make a difference between the short sound I, short sound E on articulation, I've had some adult students with their eyes just get bigger and they go, what? Those don't even sound alike anymore to me, but they could not even distinguish them. That's how great this is. So that articulation very quickly. What I found was interesting is that my adult students were used to this method, obviously. And as I moved over and introduced the fact that I had these cards, and I said, well, use what's ever comfortable for you. You let me know. Hands down, the student said, can I please see the card, the articulation card? Can you hold those up for me, please? That was so much easier in the end once we switched to speech to print, doing the sounds first. Then, as Lindsay and Stacy have pointed out, we can have different spellings, representations on the back of a grapheme representation for the sound, right? And you may cover those. Adult learners, it may be too much for them as well. So even though it's an adult learner who's being asked to do all of these things with language, this may also be too much information in the beginning. What is kind of nice, though, is I also have a card that's the poster size. It's a card because I do a lot of my work online, and so I'm using Zoom for a lot of what I do. It's nice for the students to see that eventually we'll understand all of these graphemes and the sounds that are associated and how you use them. That, I can't tell you again, the students, that's a mind blower, because they say very quickly, I lost track. That's the way they like to put it, is I lost track of what I do with the sounds and what symbol goes with what. Very quickly, I had no idea what to do with them. And then it's very encouraging to see that you have a very systematic way, and it's tied to your phonics teaching as well, so it all blends together. And that is a relief for students. The piece that I don't think that we talk enough about is that as older students, the oral language comprehension piece, they're really bright students and able to have great conversations and in-depth conversations about language. They've just never been provided a background to have the conversation. By the time students are done and taking lessons with me, they are thrilled about what they know, and they want to go out and teach, right? They want to teach everybody else and share the information they have, because it's unlocked, as we've heard before, literacy for them, right? Literally unlocking literacy for them. And so that's just kind of tying adults into those sound wall pieces. Here's another thing to just kind of look at. This is a card where typically you might see the letters. Here we have the slash marks indicating the sounds, right? And so we might go through the 44 phonemes. And this is, not a picture card that might look more juvenile, but here we have just a card that has the phonemes listed there. And then likewise, common graphemes. And notice the slash marks are gone. My students very quickly pick up on slash marks and what they mean, the difference between a phoneme and a grapheme. But these are just some more examples of materials that we can use with our students, adapting materials because we don't have a wide variety of materials that are available to us. And then putting it all together, I cannot emphasize this enough. I'm always searching for materials to get my students into a text that is appropriate. And so I am, and Stacy and Lindsay both know this because we're always hitting each other up and talking about where did you find some decodable text? And so I might have to lean into some text that might seem juvenile to a student at some point, but we are careful to talk about that and why we're using that text. And then I pick up fragments, pieces that are decodable text that might have the skills that I have taught. But that's an important step for the adult learner because they're not used to that. They're used to being tossed into text that immediately has a bunch of words in there that they have no background for. And so really trying to find decodable text for those students to have an opportunity to really practice the skills is important. Likewise, I try to find materials. I've got some listed there. I have these really nice Oxford bookworms that are fantastic. But when you have an older student who has had text demands, they're expected to know some of these texts. They're expected to at least have a little bit of background with them. My adult learners are fascinated with these and love using the Oxford bookworm learners because they've had adults drop in conversation a reference to Robinson Crusoe, maybe it's a reference to the Phantom of the Opera, and they're left out in the cold because that was never something they could ever have any relationship with. And it's fantastic to sit down. This one's Gulliver's Travels. I have an adult learner right now that we're doing Gulliver's Travels. And he said, I can't tell you how many adult conversations I dropped in somebody, in my college class, I read da-da-da. And we've read it together and delighted to have just a basic foundation. So this can be a real adventure too in putting it all together into text. So that was a really quick, I know we compressed and put a lot of information in there, but we want to get moving along. So you have questions that we can answer. I know I've been seeing the questions light up there, so I'm hoping Jillian's going to pop out some questions for us.
Thank you all for just some really good information. I always learn so much from you three. And there's been a lot of questions. I'm just going to get started right away. If we don't get to them, we will be sure to email you with all the answers. But here's one that I thought was interesting. You mentioned that we want children to have a solid foundation in their home language. However, since younger children may still be learning their own native language, are there any tips you suggest in using a sound wall, or does this matter? The same is true for English language learners. Also, would you suggest teaching short vowels first in order to avoid confusion with long letter sounds, as in the case of preschoolers? Or was this covered in the first session?
Yes and yes. It was covered in the first session, Carmen. So if you want to review that, that'd be great. But also, you are correct. Those languages can be developing at the same time, but we always start with that phoneme awareness. So they can be developing in in two different languages at the same time. Phonemic awareness isn't specific to a language. So even if, as I mentioned with the word perro for dog, I can be aware of the phonemes in that word and blend and segment them in English and then also in Spanish. Yeah, in English for dog. So that phonemic awareness can develop at the same time. At those early stages, you would address it in large part, just like you do with your English language learners. But also be aware of, try to learn a little bit about where they are in their first language too. Great question.
Awesome. Let me get to the next question. At what age should a child who is having difficulty with proper articulation and mouth-tongue placement be seen by a speech therapist?
You know what? That depends developmentally. I will say those websites that I shared, ASHA specifically, asha.org, has a lot of really good information for teachers about that. Also, the book that I recommended by Elsa Cardenas Hagen, she gives developmental timelines. so you can determine, oh, okay, this is a little bit behind. I do know that when we're focusing on phonemes in English, the phonemes that are represented by the letters R and L are usually the last ones to develop. So if you're teaching those sounds in first grade and your students aren't quite mastering them, give them a little space, a lot more practice and repetition. But if they're still not getting them in second grade, you may want to talk to your speech and language practitioner in your school.
And Stacy, I'm just going to add to that everything Stacy said, yes. And furthermore, in a school setting, I would make sure I know who the speech language pathologist is who serves my
Yes.
school. And I would even request from administration that that person be able to have some PD minutes, whether it's in our weekly PD, just to be introduced, to have a relationship, because the speech language pathologists that I know say that they love getting questions from teachers and educators, and no question is too small for them to answer. They love having relationships. So that's just my 2 cents.
100%. And there's such a tight connection between language and literacy that they're such a powerful resource. So shout out to all those SLPs. You're our favorite people.
Thank you. I want to ask the next question. I think this was the first one that was asked, and it's, can you use word walls along with sound walls?
I think we could probably all address this. I would say they have a different focus. And I know it seems like Lindsay might have something to say too, but I would say I would use a word wall for content area vocabulary. I think the word walls should be are highly useful for vocabulary development and practice, not for decoding. So we have been calling what we're talking about a sound wall. It really should be referred to frequently as a sound spelling wall, which is the focus
Yeah.
of that.
Absolutely. And you can kind of see, we talk a little bit about the limitations of a word wall in our part 1, where they're really kind of set up more from the teacher perspective, where, a child that wants to use the word wall to spell the word the, most likely doesn't know the TH spells the sound th. So how do they know to look under the T, right? Versus if you have a sound wall, then there's the phoneme th. And I had shared an experience with my student who was making the going like this, making the phoneme with his mouth, and we could point to where it was on the sound wall and then point to the spelling right there because it is a sound spelling wall. And then he's like, oh, yes. And so you could put words on your sound wall. I could put the right there under the TH phoneme, but then as students are proficient with that, I could take it down. So it really, it helps. The sound wall helps with a limitless amount of words that they can spell because they have all those spellings, for each phoneme. And certainly there may be, you may want to have a vocabulary word wall in another place, or have a bunch of, science terms for your science unit, and you could have those on a word wall. So yeah, good question.
Thank you both. There are a lot of questions about, materials and whatnot. Someone asked in session 1, Lindsay, you showed a video of one of your students using a digital sound wall where they can record themselves articulating the sounds and take pictures and send it to the teacher. They want to know more about that, what's it called and whatnot.
Yeah, that is from Reading Horizons. And if you missed that, again, you can watch part 1, or there's even a longer version of that. It's just a screencast video on, if you just look my name on YouTube, I have a little screencast video of that app if you want to look at it.
Nice. Thank you. And then one more. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Jillian, if I could just interject. This webinar really is focusing on sound walls. This is not an endorsement. It's not a commercial for Reading Horizons. We are partial to that. I will just be clear because we helped develop it. So of course it's going to work well for us. But if you watch our first part, you'll see there are a lot of ways to construct your own and other resources too. Again, we're partial to the Reading Horizons curriculum, but that's just us. That you don't have to do that. So just want to be clear about that.
Yeah, our part 1 has tons of pictures of different ones, which is kind of nice. So you can see how you can make them all work in your classroom.
I love it. Thank you. And then real quick, how long are the sound wall lessons or how long should they be?
3 to 5 minutes, I would say. I mean, it's pretty quick. I would not be spending 15, 20 minutes a day on only soundwell instruction, right? That phonemic awareness should be quick, and then you want to connect it with the letters and going into your phonics lesson. So that's why I kind of say remember that overall goal. Proficient readers and spellers.
Yeah, and again, maybe we should just change the general language. We keep calling this a sound wall, but if we say sound spelling wall, then it really does emphasize where we're going with it, right? Then it helps go literally from speech to print.
Thank you. If we didn't get to your question, we are going to write them all up and we will email you all of the responses. Is there anything before we wrap up, though, that you three want to add before I wrap us up? Any questions you wish would have been asked or anything like that?
I just want to emphasize that we talk a lot about the production of those sounds, placement. I don't think that can be. Don't overlook that. That's really more important to the brain than we know. And then just what we just said, keeping in mind the end goal. This isn't taught in isolation. We're connecting it to on that road to comprehending reading.
Fabulous. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. We know that this is super busy time of year, and we just appreciate you for taking the time to be here and to learn all about sound walls. At Reading Horizons, we are looking for that collaborative partnership research. That's an excellent opportunity to receive professional learning and coaching while identifying the evidence of impact on students and teacher practices. And this comes at no cost to districts while participating. So contact Stephanie Meyer for more information. Then the last thing I just wanted to remind you too is about Literacy Talks. These three amazing women are the hosts of Literacy Talks. It's an awesome podcast. So if you are not listening and you enjoy today, you will love it. I guarantee it. And on Literacy Talks website, readinghorizons.com/literacy talks, that's where we're going to be posting the winner of the Sound Wall kit, Sound City. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And thank you again. If you want to learn more about us, you can find us at readinghorizons.com, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
hosts, and
Yeah,
thank
thank
you, all
you.
you